Joe DiMaggio secretly paid medical bills for 100 war veterans who couldn't afford treatment. He spent over $200,000 of his own money and never told anyone about it. When the story finally came out 15 years later, it made grown men cry. Why did America's greatest baseball player choose to bankrupt himself to help soldiers he'd never met? September 15, 1949. Brooklyn Veterans Hospital. Joe DiMaggio walked quietly through the halls, stopping at the billing office with a briefcase full of cash. "I want to pay for every veteran who can't afford their medical treatment," he told the shocked administrator. What Joe did next would remain one of America's most beautiful secrets for over a decade. This is the story of Joe DiMaggio's greatest sacrifice, and how a baseball legend proved that true heroism happens not on the field, but in the service of those who serve their country. Joe DiMaggio had just finished another successful season with the New York Yankees in 1949. He was 34 years old and earning $100,000 a year, making him one of the highest-paid athletes in America. But Joe's wealth couldn't ease the guilt he felt every time he read about wounded veterans struggling to pay for medical care. World War II had ended 4 years earlier, but thousands of American soldiers were still suffering from injuries they had sustained in battle. Many of these men needed ongoing medical treatment, surgery, and rehabilitation. The government provided some assistance through the Veterans Administration, but the system was overwhelmed and underfunded. Many veterans fell through the cracks and couldn't get the care they desperately needed. Joe had not served in World War II because he had been classified as essential personnel for civilian morale. While other young men went to war, Joe played baseball to keep Americans' spirits up during the dark days of the conflict. This exemption had allowed Joe to continue his career and earn substantial money, but it also filled him with a deep sense of guilt. Joe felt like he owed a debt to the men who had fought while he played games. Joe's guilt intensified in the summer of 1949 when he met a young veteran named Tommy Sullivan at a charity event. Tommy was 26 years old and had lost his left leg in the Battle of the Bulge. He needed a prosthetic limb and physical therapy, but he couldn't afford the treatment. "Mr. DiMaggio," Tommy said, "I used to listen to your games on the radio when I was in the hospital in France. Your hitting streak kept us going when things got bad." Joe was moved by Tommy's words, but he was shocked to learn about Tommy's situation. "You mean the government isn't paying for your prosthetic?" Joe asked. "The VA is backed up for months," Tommy replied. "They said I might get approved next year, but I need to work now to support my family." Joe couldn't believe that a war hero was being forced to wait for basic medical care. That night, Joe called his accountant and asked him to cut a check for $5,000 to cover Tommy's medical expenses. "Send it anonymously," Joe instructed. "I don't want him to know it came from me." A week later, Tommy received a letter saying that an anonymous donor had paid for his prosthetic and rehabilitation. Joe felt good about helping Tommy, but he soon realized that Tommy's situation was not unique. Joe began visiting veterans' hospitals around New York City to see how many other soldiers were in similar situations. What Joe discovered horrified him. At Brooklyn Veterans Hospital, Joe met dozens of men who were suffering because they couldn't afford proper medical care. There was Frank Martinez, who had lost his sight in the Pacific and needed surgery to restore partial vision. The operation cost $3,000, which Frank couldn't afford on his disability pension. There was Robert Johnson, who had been injured by shrapnel in Italy and needed multiple surgeries to repair nerve damage in his hands. Each operation cost $2,000, and Robert needed at least 5 procedures. There was William O'Brien, who had been exposed to poison gas and needed ongoing lung treatment. The medication cost $100 per month, which was more than half of William's disability check. Story after story broke Joe's heart. These men had given everything for their country, and now their country was failing to care for them. Joe made a decision that would change his life forever. Joe contacted Dr. Harold Stevens, the administrator at Brooklyn Veterans Hospital. "Dr. Stevens," Joe said during their meeting, "I want to help the veterans who can't afford their medical bills." "That's very generous of you, Mr. DiMaggio," Dr. Stevens replied. "Any donation would be appreciated." "I don't want to make a donation," Joe said. "I want to pay all the outstanding medical bills for every veteran who needs help." Dr. Stevens was stunned. "Mr. DiMaggio, there are dozens of men who owe thousands of dollars each. The total amount could be enormous." "I don't care about the cost," Joe replied. "These men sacrificed for America. Now I want to sacrifice for them." Dr. Stevens pulled out a file filled with unpaid medical bills. Right now we have 47 veterans who owe a total of $89,000, Dr. Stevens said. Joe didn't hesitate. I'll pay it all, but I have one condition. No one can know that the money came from me. Why don't you want credit for such a generous act? Dr. Stevens asked. Because I didn't fight in the war, Joe replied. I played baseball while these men bled for our freedom. The least I can do is help them quietly. Dr. Stevens was moved by Joe's humility and sincerity. Within a week, Joe had written checks totaling $89,000 to cover every outstanding medical bill at Brooklyn Veterans Hospital. The hospital sent letters to all the affected veterans, telling them that an anonymous donor had paid their debts. The veterans were amazed and grateful, but they had no idea that their hero was the same baseball player whose games had entertained them during the war. Joe felt a sense of satisfaction he had never experienced on a baseball field. But Joe's charitable work was just beginning. Word of the anonymous donations spread to other veterans' hospitals in the New York area. Within a month, Joe received calls from administrators at Manhattan Veterans Hospital, Queens Veterans Hospital, and Bronx Veterans Hospital. Each hospital had dozens of veterans with unpaid medical bills, and each administrator hoped that the anonymous donor might help their patients too. Joe visited each hospital personally to assess the need. At Manhattan Veterans Hospital, Joe met 23 veterans who owed a total of $52,000. At Queens Veterans Hospital, there were 19 veterans who owed $38,000. At Bronx Veterans Hospital, 11 veterans owed $21,000. Joe paid all of these bills without hesitation. By the end of 1949, Joe had spent $200,000 of his own money to help 100 war veterans get the medical care they needed. $200,000 represented 2 years of Joe's salary. He had given away most of his savings to help soldiers he had never met. Joe's teammates and friends noticed that he was living more modestly than usual. Joe stopped eating at expensive restaurants and started bringing sandwiches to the ballpark. Joe gave up his luxury apartment and moved to a smaller place to save money. Joe even sold his expensive car and bought a used one instead. "Joe, are you having financial problems?" asked his teammate Yogi Berra. "No, I'm just trying to be more careful with money," Joe replied. Joe's teammates didn't know that he was living on a tight budget because he had given away most of his wealth to help veterans. Joe continued his anonymous charity work throughout 1950 and 1951. Every few months, Joe would visit a different veterans hospital and pay outstanding medical bills. Joe helped veterans get prosthetic limbs, eye surgery, psychiatric treatment, and physical therapy. Some veterans needed expensive operations that cost $10,000 or more. Joe paid for these procedures without question. Other veterans needed ongoing medication that cost hundreds of dollars per month. Joe set up accounts to cover these expenses for years. Joe's generosity had no limits when it came to helping wounded soldiers. By 1952, Joe had helped more than 200 veterans and had spent nearly $400,000 on medical bills. Joe was approaching financial ruin, but he didn't care. He believed that helping veterans was more important than his own financial security. However, Joe's secret charity work was about to be discovered. In the spring of 1952, a young journalist named Patricia Walsh was working on a story about veterans' medical care. Patricia was interviewing veterans about their experiences with the healthcare system when she began to notice a pattern. Dozens of veterans told Patricia the same story. An anonymous donor had mysteriously paid their medical bills. "Someone paid for my surgery, but I never found out who it was," one veteran told Patricia. "My prosthetic was paid for by a mystery person," said another veteran. "All my medical bills were covered by someone who wouldn't give their name," said a third veteran. Patricia realized that someone had been systematically helping veterans across New York City. Patricia decided to investigate who this anonymous donor might be. Patricia contacted hospital administrators and asked them about the mysterious payments. Most administrators refused to talk, saying they had promised to keep the donor's identity secret. But Dr. Stevens at Brooklyn Veterans Hospital was impressed by Patricia's sincere interest in veterans' welfare. "I can't tell you who the donor is," Dr. Stevens said, "but I can tell you that this person has helped more veterans than anyone in America." "How much money are we talking about?" Patricia asked. "Hundreds of thousands of dollars," Dr. Stevens replied. Patricia knew she was onto a major story. Someone with significant wealth was quietly helping veterans on a massive scale. Patricia spent weeks trying to track down the donor's identity. She checked bank records, interviewed hospital staff, and talked to dozens of veterans who had been helped. Finally, Patricia got a break. A nurse at Manhattan Veterans Hospital remembered seeing a famous-looking man visiting the billing office several times. "I think it might have been that baseball player," the nurse told Patricia. "He looked like Joe DiMaggio." Patricia contacted Joe's agent to request an interview about veteran affairs. "Mr. DiMaggio doesn't usually comment on political issues," the agent said. "This isn't political," Patricia replied. "It's about helping wounded soldiers." Joe agreed to meet with Patricia, thinking she wanted to discuss general veteran support. When Patricia arrived at Joe's apartment, she was surprised by how modestly he was living. Joe's apartment was small and simply furnished, not what she expected from one of America's highest-paid athletes. "Mr. DiMaggio," Patricia began, "I'm writing a story about anonymous donations to veterans' hospitals. Do you know anything about these contributions?" Joe's expression changed immediately. He realized that Patricia was investigating his secret charity work. "I don't know what you're talking about," Joe said nervously. "Someone has paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills for veterans across New York," Patricia continued. "This person has helped more than 200 soldiers get the treatment they needed." Joe remained silent, but Patricia could see the emotion in his eyes. "Mr. DiMaggio, a nurse at Manhattan Veterans Hospital, thinks she saw you visiting the billing office," Patricia said gently. Joe knew his secret was about to be exposed. He sat down heavily and put his head in his hands. "Please don't write this story," Joe said quietly. "Why not?" Patricia asked. "What you've done is incredible. People should know about your generosity." "Because I didn't earn the right to be called a hero," Joe replied. "I played baseball while those men fought and died. Helping them now is the least I can do." Patricia was moved by Joe's humility and sincerity. "Mr. DiMaggio, you've given away nearly $500,000 to help veterans," Patricia said. "That's not guilt. That's heroism." "Those men are the real heroes," Joe insisted. "They gave their bodies and their futures for America. I just gave money." Patricia could see that Joe genuinely believed he didn't deserve recognition for his charity work. "If you publish this story, it will ruin everything," Joe continued. "The veterans will feel like charity cases, and I'll look like I'm trying to buy good publicity." Patricia understood Joe's concerns, but she also believed that his story could inspire other wealthy Americans to help veterans. "What if I don't use your name?" Patricia suggested. "What if I just write about an anonymous wealthy person helping veterans?" Joe considered this compromise. "Would you really keep my name out of it?" "If that's what you want," Patricia replied. Joe agreed to let Patricia write the story without identifying him as the donor. Patricia's article was published in the New York Herald Tribune in June 1952. The headline read, "Mystery Millionaire Helps Hundreds of War Veterans." The story described how an anonymous donor had paid nearly $500,000 in medical bills for wounded soldiers across New York City. The article praised the unknown benefactor and challenged other wealthy Americans to follow his example. The story generated enormous public interest, but Joe's identity remained secret. However, Joe's anonymity wouldn't last much longer. In 1954, Dr. Stevens at Brooklyn Veterans Hospital was diagnosed with cancer. As Dr. Stevens prepared for surgery, he was worried about keeping Joe's secret if he died. Dr. Stevens called Joe to his hospital bed. "Mr. DiMaggio," Dr. Stevens said weakly, "I need to tell you something. I've kept records of all your donations, and I want you to have them." Dr. Stevens handed Joe a thick folder containing documentation of every payment Joe had made. "Why are you giving me this?" Joe asked. "Because someday people need to know what you did," Dr. Stevens replied. "These records prove that you helped more veterans than any single person in American history." Joe was reluctant to take the folder, but Dr. Stevens insisted. "Promise me that when the time is right, you'll let people know about your charity work," Dr. Stevens said. "Veterans deserve to know who their guardian angel was." Joe promised Dr. Stevens that he would consider making his charity work public at the appropriate time. Dr. Stevens died 2 weeks later, taking Joe's secret to his grave. Joe continued his charity work quietly for several more years. By 1956, Joe had helped more than 400 veterans and had spent over $600,000 on medical bills. Joe had to take out loans to maintain his lifestyle because he had given away most of his earnings. In 1957, Joe's financial situation became critical. His agent warned him that he was approaching bankruptcy. "Joe, you have to stop giving away so much money," his agent said. "You need to think about your own future." Joe realized that he couldn't continue his charity work at the same pace without destroying his own financial security. Joe made the difficult decision to scale back his veteran assistance program. Instead of paying all medical bills, Joe decided to focus on the most critical cases, veterans who needed life-saving surgery or treatment. Joe continued this modified charity work for the next decade, helping dozens more veterans each year. By 1964, Joe had assisted more than 600 veterans and had spent nearly $1 million of his own money. But Joe's secret was about to be revealed in a way he never expected. In 1965, a veteran named Michael Thompson was being honored at a ceremony for his community service work. Michael had lost both legs in Korea and had become a successful advocate for disabled veterans. During his acceptance speech, Michael told the audience about the mysterious donor who had changed his life. 15 years ago, someone paid for my prosthetic legs and my rehabilitation, Michael said. I never knew who this person was, but their kindness made it possible for me to build a new life. Michael continued, I've spent years trying to find this anonymous hero so I could thank them personally. Recently, I discovered that this same person helped hundreds of other veterans like me. I finally learned the identity of our guardian angel, Michael announced. It was Joe DiMaggio. The audience gasped in amazement. Michael explained how he had pieced together the evidence and confirmed Joe's identity through hospital records and witness accounts. Joe DiMaggio gave away over $1 million to help wounded soldiers, Michael said. He lived modestly for years so that we could have the medical care we needed. The crowd gave Michael a standing ovation, but they were cheering for Joe DiMaggio's incredible generosity. News of Michael's revelation spread quickly through the veteran community. Within days, newspapers across the country were calling Joe to ask about his charity work. Joe initially tried to deny the story, but too many people had confirmed the details. Finally, Joe agreed to give one interview about his veteran assistance program. Yes, I helped some veterans with their medical bills, Joe admitted to reporters. But it wasn't charity, it was an honor to help the men who served our country. How much money did you give away? A reporter asked. I didn't keep track, Joe replied. It doesn't matter how much I gave. What matters is that these men got the treatment they needed. Why did you keep it secret for so long? Another reporter asked. Because these veterans earned their medical care through their service, Joe said. I didn't want them to feel like they were receiving charity. Joe's interview was published in newspapers across America. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Letters poured in from veterans, their families, and grateful Americans who were amazed by Joe's generosity. President Lyndon Johnson invited Joe to the White House to honor him for his service to veterans. Joe DiMaggio represents the best of America, President Johnson said. He understood that freedom isn't free, and he helped pay the price for the men who protected our liberty. Joe was uncomfortable with all the attention, but he was moved by the letters he received from veterans. One letter came from Frank Martinez, the veteran who had received eye surgery thanks to Joe's donation. Mr. DiMaggio, Frank wrote, you gave me back my sight, but more importantly, you gave me back my hope. I was able to see my children grow up because of your kindness. Another letter came from Robert Johnson, who had received hand surgery. I became a watchmaker after my surgery, Robert wrote. I've been able to support my family for 15 years because you gave me the use of my hands again. Letter after letter told similar stories of how Joe's generosity had transformed lives. Joe realized that his charity work had created a ripple effect of positive change that extended far beyond the initial medical treatments. The veterans he helped had gone on to become productive members of society, raising families, starting businesses, and contributing to their communities. Joe's investment in their health had paid dividends for America as a whole. In 1966, veterans groups across the country organized Joe DiMaggio Appreciation Day to honor his contributions to veteran welfare. More than 500 veterans and their families gathered at Yankee Stadium to thank Joe personally. One by one, veterans stood up to tell their stories about how Joe's help had changed their lives. Tommy Sullivan, the first veteran Joe had helped, was now a successful businessman who employed 50 people. Michael Thompson had become a lawyer who specialized in veterans' rights cases. Frank Martinez had started a nonprofit organization that helped other disabled veterans find employment. Each success story reinforced the incredible impact of Joe's generosity. Joe was moved to tears as he listened to these testimonials. You men are the real heroes, Joe told the crowd. I just did what any American should do for the people who protected our freedom. The crowd disagreed. They knew that Joe's sacrifice had been extraordinary and that his humility made his generosity even more remarkable. Joe DiMaggio's Veteran Assistance Program continued to inspire charitable giving for decades. Other athletes and celebrities began supporting veteran causes, citing Joe's example as their inspiration. When Joe died in 1999, his funeral was attended by hundreds of veterans whose lives he had touched. At the ceremony, Michael Thompson spoke on behalf of all the veterans Joe had helped. Joe DiMaggio hit 361 home runs in his baseball career, Michael said, but his greatest hits were the lives he saved and the hope he restored to wounded warriors. Michael concluded, "Joe taught us that true heroism isn't measured by athletic achievements, but by the sacrifices we make for others who have sacrificed for us." In 1975, a group of veterans who had been helped by Joe decided to start their own charity organization. Led by Tommy Sullivan and Michael Thompson, these veterans created the Guardian Angel Foundation to help other wounded soldiers. "Joe DiMaggio was our guardian angel," Tommy explained. "Now we want to be guardian angels for other veterans." The foundation grew quickly as more veterans joined the effort. By 1980, the Guardian Angel Foundation was helping hundreds of veterans each year. The organization had raised over $2 million, largely through donations from people inspired by Joe's example. When Joe learned about the foundation, he was deeply moved. "These men have turned my small act of kindness into a movement," Joe said. Joe agreed to serve as honorary chairman of the Guardian Angel Foundation. Under Joe's guidance, the organization expanded to include educational scholarships for veterans' children. By 1985, the foundation had helped more than 2,000 veterans and awarded scholarships to 500 students. When Joe attended the foundation's anniversary celebration in 1985, he was amazed. 36 years ago, I helped one veteran named Tommy Sullivan, Joe told the crowd. Today, that single act has helped thousands of people. The Guardian Angel Foundation continued to grow throughout the 1990s. When Joe died in 1999, the foundation was renamed the Joe DiMaggio Guardian Angel Foundation. Today, the organization has helped more than 10,000 veterans and awarded over $50 million in assistance. Joe DiMaggio's story reminds us that one person's generosity can create waves of kindness that last for generations. If this story of quiet heroism and selfless service moved you, subscribe for more untold stories of how true greatness is measured not by what we achieve for ourselves, but by what we sacrifice for others who sacrificed for us. Like this video if you believe Joe's medical charity was his greatest achievement, and comment below. 19. How can we better honor our veterans today? Next week we're revealing another story of how ordinary people become extraordinary heroes when they choose service over self. Remember, the greatest victories aren't always won on playing fields, sometimes they're won in hospital corridors, where heroes help heroes heal.